While Canada enjoys a reputation as a peacekeeper on the world stage, its history proves it to be anything but. In his new book, The Ugly Canadian, Stephen Harper's Foreign Policy, author and activist Yves Engler explores how the Harper government is trying to further militarize Canada and create a change in perception of Canada's foreign policy. This is the GRTV Feature Interview with your host James Corbett and our special guest, Yves Engler.
Well, I think Canadians certainly have a very positive self portrayal of their role in the world, and often lots of people in the world have a generally positive perception of Canada's role in the world. I think that's somewhat exaggerated. Certainly, Canadians have an exaggerated sense of how much Canada's liked elsewhere. And I think that the Conservative government's recent policies, sort of more pro-military, pro-corporate policies of recent years, pro-imperial policies of recent years, have definitely worsened Canada's image around the world. But there's generally a sort of fairly positive sense of Canada in the world, and I think that's partly based upon the fact that within Canada, I'm not talking about Canada's foreign policy, but within Canada, it's a fairly prosperous place. It's the multiculturalism is seen fairly positively. Obviously, that's multiculturalism based upon dispossession of First Nations, but there is sort of a general sort of perception of Canada, I would say, generally positively around the world.
And a lot of this stems back to initiatives that have been undertaken by former Canadian prime ministers, like, for example, of course, the United Nations peacekeeping idea, which was obviously famously hatched in Canada, and Canada is strongly associated with that. But again, that speaks to I think, a very big disconnect between the perception and the reality of what this actually amounts to. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about some of the history of Canada's actual military involvement in the international stage.
Yeah, well, the first thing to point out about the peacekeeping is the idea wasn't hatched in Ottawa. It was an idea hatched by John Foster Dulles, the American Secretary of State, who basically put forward the idea to Lester Pearson, who was then the Canadian Foreign Affairs Minister, who has become associated with the idea of peacekeeping, and he's a sort of central kind of mythical character in the history of Canadian foreign policy. And my previous book was called Lester Pearson's Peacekeeping: The Truth May Hurt, where I go into some of that history. But Canada's been very tied into basically the two main empires of the past couple hundred years: the British Empire, and then since World War II, the American Empire. And alongside that has been participation in a whole series of different wars, going from the Boer War in South Africa, where 20,000 Boer women and children were put into concentration camps and killed. There was about 7,000 Canadian troops that participated in that. To the First World War, where tens and hundreds of thousands of Canadians fought. To the Second World War, to those are obviously Canada joined those wars so at the behest of London and to help the British Empire out. And since World War II, you have the Korean War, where 27,000 Canadian troops fought in the brutal war in Korea, where 3 to 4 million people were killed. Obviously led by Washington, and to moving forward to the first Iraq War or the bombing of Yugoslavia, Canada's participation, and more recently, obviously, the bombing of Libya and the war in Afghanistan. So Canada's been quite a militaristic country for a long time. Part tied in with the major military powers of the day, but I think the Harper government has really deepened that, and there was a sort of focus more on sort of a bit of a softer form of militarism, and the Harper government has really deepened that to being quite explicitly militaristic and ramping up the military budget, setting up Canadian military bases in 7 countries around the world, permanent Canadian military bases. They're in the process of setting those up to be better set to participate in future wars. So there is certainly a militaristic shift in recent years with the Conservative government.
Well, that's right, and I think once again we're looking at least the perception of Canada historically has been that it's been more or less willing to participate in military interventions. So, for example, of course, we saw Chrétien famously not going along with the invasion of Iraq, although, as you say, there's a lot of other ways in which Canada did support the American Empire during the coalition of the willing phase. But it's hard to imagine, for example, Harper saying no to such an invasion at this stage. So let's talk about some of the specific ways that that Harper has shaped or reshaped Canada's military intervention.
Yeah, well, first of all, they've increased the military budget from about $15 billion to $23 billion. They've increased the size of the military, specifically the Joint Task Force 2, Canadian Special Commandos, similar to like Navy SEALs, and the Special Forces in general, and a big part of the point of increasing those forces is that they operate in secrecy, so they deniability from the standpoint of for the military decision makers. Like I said, setting up permanent Canadian military bases in countries around the world. And obviously, an important part of that was the bombing of Libya. A Canadian commander oversaw the whole bombing of Libya. Canadian fighter jets were heavily involved. Dropped hundreds of bombs in that war. There was allegations of the Joint Task Force 2 commandos, special commandos on the ground in Libya, which would have been completely in contravention to the UN resolutions. That can't be confirmed because everything that JTF2 does is secretive. Obviously, continued engagement in Afghanistan. There, Canada hasn't been involved in Afghanistan for more than 10 years now. The most recent phase is, despite strong opposition within the public among Canadians to move Canadian troops, the Conservative government has maintained 950 Canadian troops there under the auspices that they're training Afghan military, which in fact is, it's a much more militaristic orientation of training than what kind of come to mind when you hear the term training. So there's many different elements, and one of the elements is just at the cultural level, really strong promotion of the military here within Canada, and at the hockey games, at the CFL, the Canadian Football League games, troops are there regularly doing the flyovers, really trying to sort of build up this sense of military ethos among the Canadian public, and it's a pillar. It's definitely a pillar of the Conservatives' foreign policy.
That's right, and I think it is worrying to see some of those signs. But on the flip side of this, you point out, for example, on your website that there is some signs of progress in all of this, including the fact that although, of course, Canada did take part in that intervention in Libya last year, as you note, it's nothing near the type of interventions that were taking place, for example, in the Korean War 50 years ago, and the types of devastation that was being wrought there. So, in some senses, there is some idea that perhaps we have made progress, and that there is a general anti-war sentiment that exists now that did not exist half a century ago. Can you speak to that idea?
Yeah, I think it's an important point, because I think too often activists, people who are not in agreement with the decisions of the day from the foreign policy establishment, don't get a sense of that what they're doing, their activism, their campaigns are having an effect. And at one level, and if you look at it very narrowly, that can often be the case. But if you take a bit of a longer term view of things, and I think that if you look at what Canada did in Korea, where 3 to 4 million people were killed, where at one point the Americans decided to stop bombing North Korea because all buildings of more than 2 stories were thought to have been destroyed. I mean, this was a level of barbarity and just violence it's kind of hard to imagine. And you fast forward to today, the bombing of Libya, the war in Afghanistan, both of which are, I think, clearly have not been in the interests of the majority of the population of those countries, not been in the interests of the world more generally. But those wars look wonderful next to what Canada did in Korea. The level of violence is not close to as extreme. And that's because I think the anti-war movements, the international solidarity movements have civilized the Canadian military. There's been greater constraints on what they can get away with. And that's because of the anti-war movements of the 1960s against the Vietnam War, the Central American solidarity movements, the South African apartheid solidarity movements, the anti-Iraq War, first and second Iraq War movements. There's been a sort of a cumulative effect of in terms of teaching people, make people understand what war means, and also having more solidarity with people elsewhere. Breaking down sense racism and growing sense of sort of internationalism. So I think that that is a very, in my opinion, something that those of us who are critical of the current state of Canadian foreign policy need to keep in mind when we're struggling. That there has been a sort of cumulative effect in some senses if you go back 60 years.
Now, in recent years, there's been growing talk about the Arctic as a new frontier, I suppose, for militarization, for Canada staking a military claim to try to supposedly justify or basically put a stake in its claims to Arctic resources, etc. But of course, the flip side of that is that it's just another justification for increasing military expenditures and budgets. What do you think about the bellicose nature of some of the statements that have been made about the Arctic in recent years, and some of the type of Cold War rhetoric almost that we've seen with some of the other Arctic players?
Yeah, the Conservatives have done have a number of instances where they've tried to portray Russia as on the cusp of invading Canada, just totally off the wall, ridiculous kind of comments. One time when Obama was visiting Ottawa, they implied that Russian forces were on the cusp of invading. I mean, as if the the north of Canada is close to Ottawa. I mean, I'm not sure exactly how many thousands of kilometers it is, but it's a ways. But it fits. If it was sort of justification for the fighter jets and justification for military spending. One of the ironies of all this is that the F-35 fighter jet that there's been lots of controversy about, where they're I think it's 65 of them they're planning on buying. It's $35 billion they're going to spend. Those fighter jets are actually not ideal for protection of the North. Those fighter jets are better oriented towards bombing Libya or some future endeavor like that. But the rhetoric about defending Canada's North does have some traction with the public, and I think has sort of helps justify spending money. This $33 billion naval shipbuilding project they've launched, and there's even WikiLeaks documents where American ambassador in Ottawa talks about how the Conservatives have made this issue part of their brand, and they're not really taking this seriously, this whole North stuff, but it's a brand. Obviously, there's Canadian corporate interests that with the melting of Arctic ice, see greater role for oil exploration, greater role for different sea routes and shipping routes and the like. But the whole sort of military component to this is mostly just sort of rhetoric to justify something they want to do.
So what is the general sentiment on the ground there in Canada about Harper and the way that he is changing or has changed the country? Do you think there are a lot of people who see those changes and are concerned about them, or do you think that most people are sort of just absorbing it as part of the cultural milieu?
Yeah, I mean, the thing with foreign policy is it's very removed from most people's lives, and so the capacity to lie and distort what's actually happening is pretty great, because we don't have I didn't grow up in Afghanistan. I don't have a whole lot of personal experience, and 99.9% of Canadians don't have that personal experience of what it would be like to have Canadian troops in Afghanistan, occupying where you live. So their capacity to sort of distort things is really great, and obviously the corporate media goes along with that, and very much serves power. And the narrowness of debate on foreign policy is pretty extreme. It's pretty tight on domestic issues, but on foreign policy issues, it's that much narrower in terms of the range of what can be said. And so to a certain extent, the population just sort of absorbs the changes and is kind of unaware. Actually, in recent days, recent weeks, there's been quite a bit of outrage, even in the corporate media, about the Conservatives' position on Palestine and their aggressive threatening of Abbas to not bring forward the statehood bid at the UN, and then voting against it, and being among just a couple of countries in the world that were voting against it, and then right away a couple days later voting against a resolution. Voting against a whole series of resolutions, again being among a few countries' resolutions in support of Palestinian rights, but then also yesterday, the day before, voting against a resolution calling for a nuclear-free Middle East, and because they spend a lot of time talking about Iran's possible nuclear weapons program, but Israel's significant stockpile of nuclear weapons seems to not bother them at all. And so voting against this resolution, again, the whole world basically supported it against U.S., Canada, and a couple other countries. So there has been a certain criticism about that, and also some changes they've made with the Canadian Aid Agency, and explicitly designing Canadian aid money to serve the interests of Canadian mining companies abroad, to basically pacify local opposition to Canadian mining projects abroad. And this is another thing that's been playing out in the media the past couple of days. So actually in recent days there has been quite a bit of criticism. It's criticism that's still ultimately kind of around the edges. It's not sort of fundamental criticism. Of the criticisms I put forward is that these policies are should be seen as crimes against humanity. They're fundamentally immoral. It's not a tactical question. It's not a mistake, but these are really immoral policies that are being pursued. And you hear very little of that in the dominant media. But there is really, I think, quite a groundswell of opposition to Harper, not just on the foreign policy front, but just sort of in general. And but at the end of the day, he is very serving the big business interests very, very well. So and most of the media in this country, of course, is owned by a handful of very rich people. So there's obvious biases there. But I think there is quite a bit of opposition. But is it enough to defeat the government? Is it it's very, on the foreign policy front, it's very kind of amorphous. It's not particularly well organized whatsoever.
For more on this story and other breaking news and current events, please go to globalresearch.ca. For more research and analysis by James Corbett, please go to corbettreport.com.